The crystalline chambers of the Galactic Confederation's 12th Circuit Court gleamed with clinical perfection. The walls shone like polished diamonds under the bright lights. Adjudicator Bayek stood tall at the front of the room. His pale white skin glowed under the artificial lighting, making him look almost ghost-like against the dark blue backdrop of the judicial platform. Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia waited quietly. She stood straight and tall in her deep blue Federation uniform. The metallic insignia on her chest caught the light as she breathed. Her dark brown skin contrasted with the sterile whiteness of the courtroom. She had been standing for nearly 3 hours as the adjudicator reviewed her case files. The Albarans have maintained galactic order for 8 centuries, Beck said to the room, his voice flat and emotionless. We serve because we alone can set aside personal feelings for the greater good. Jia fought the urge to roll her eyes. Everyone in the galaxy knew the Albarans weren't as perfect as they claimed. They just hid their emotions better than most species. The courtroom was nearly empty. Only 3 other humans sat in the audience section, fellow diplomats who had come to support Jia. The rest of the seats were filled with Albarans, their white faces blank as they watched the proceedings. Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia, Adjudicator Beck announced, his voice bouncing off the hard surfaces of the room. You stand accused of Protocol Violation Code 5291C. Improper translation resulting in diplomatic confusion during the Centauri peace negotiations. Jia kept her face calm, though inside she felt a storm of anger. The charges were unfair. During the peace talks between Earth and Centauri Prime, she had adjusted the translation of certain phrases to account for cultural differences. If she had translated the Centauri leader's words exactly as the protocol demanded, the Earth representatives would have been deeply insulted. Her small changes had saved the negotiations, but the Albarans didn't care about results. They only cared about rules. Do you wish to speak in your defense? Beck asked, though his tone suggested it would make no difference. Jia cleared her throat. Yes, Adjudicator. The standard translation would have. The standard translation is standard for a reason. Beck interrupted. It has been calculated to provide maximum clarity across all known languages. With respect, Adjudicator, Jia said, keeping her voice steady. Language isn't just about words, it's about context, culture, and meaning. The Centauri phrase Dakt Morovex literally translates to, your ancestors weep, but in their culture, it's a grave insult implying. The court is not interested in cultural interpretations. Beck cut her off again. The protocol exists precisely to eliminate such subjective variables. One of Jia's colleagues in the audience, Officer Lee, shook his head in frustration. Everyone who worked in diplomacy knew the Albarans' rigid approach often created more problems than it solved. But no one could convince them of this. Jia tried one more time. Adjudicator, the peace treaty was successfully signed because of my adjustments. If I had followed the exact protocol, success does not justify violation, Beck said. The ends never justify the means in matters of galactic law. Jia fell silent. There was no point arguing further. The Albarans had made up their minds. Before she even entered the courtroom, Beck tapped a glowing panel in front of him. The court has reviewed all evidence. Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia, your service record shows 17 previous successful diplomatic missions. This fact has been considered. However, rules must be enforced consistently. He paused, looking directly at Jia with his pale gray eyes. The court finds you guilty and imposes a fine of 15,000 credits and suspension from diplomatic duties for 1 standard quarter cycle. The fine would take most of Jia's savings. The suspension would keep her grounded for 3 months. But what hurt most was the mark on her record. She had worked so hard to build her reputation. As the court cleared, Officer Lee approached her. This is ridiculous, Jia. Everyone knows you saved those negotiations. It doesn't matter, Jia said quietly. Not to them. What neither Jia nor the Albarans knew was that this wasn't the end of the story. In her quarters aboard the Starship Horizon, a message was waiting. One that would soon turn everything upside down for both Jia and Adjudicator Bayek. The door to Jia's quarters slid shut with a soft hiss. She threw her uniform jacket onto the bed and sank into the chair at her desk. The trial had drained her completely. 15,000 credits gone, and 3 months of suspension. All because she had made a smart choice that the rule-loving Albarans couldn't understand. Gia rubbed her eyes. Her small room on the starship horizon felt even smaller today. The walls were standard military gray, with just a few personal touches. A small plant from Earth, a photo of her family, and a shelf of real paper books. Real books were rare and expensive, but Gia loved the feel of pages between her fingers. A soft beep came from her communication panel. The screen showed an incoming transmission from Earth, marked private and secure. Gia tapped the accept button, expecting it to be a message from her parents about the trial. Instead, the smiling face of Mr. Park appeared. He was an older man with kind eyes and gray hair, the head of Galaxy Press, one of the largest publishing companies on Earth. Gia, I've been trying to reach you all day, Mr. Park said, his voice excited even across the vast distance of space. Sorry, Mr. Park. I was in court, Gia said, trying to push away her bad mood. Court? What happened? Gia waved her hand. Just Albaran justice, nothing important. She didn't want to talk about it. What can I do for you? Mr. Park's smile grew even wider. I have amazing news. Your manuscript, Bridges Between Stars, has won the Galactic Wordsmith Award. This is the first time a human has received this honor in the award's 200-year history. Gia froze. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The Galactic Wordsmith Award was the highest literary honor in known space. For centuries, it had been given to the greatest writers from 100 different worlds, but never to a human. Are you sure? She finally managed to ask. Absolutely certain. The judges were unanimous. They said your work shows a deep understanding of how different species think and communicate. They called it revolutionary. Gia smiled for the first time that day. The irony was not lost on her. She had just been punished for her approach to cross-species communication, and now she was being celebrated for the exact same thing. Of course, the Albarans had no idea that Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia was actually J.K. Starfall, the author they had just chosen to honor. She had kept her two lives completely separate. In her military career, she was Jia, a diplomat and translator. In her writing life, she was J.K. Starfall, whose books on language and communication were read across the galaxy. Only Mr. Park and a few close friends knew her secret. When is the ceremony? Gia asked. In 3 weeks. It will be held on Central Station. All the important people in the galaxy will be there. The Albaran Chief Justice will present the award. Gia laughed, though there was little humor in it. 3 weeks? That's perfect timing. What do you mean? Mr. Park looked confused. I just got suspended from duty for 3 months. I'll have plenty of time to attend. Mr. Park's face showed concern. Suspended? Why? Gia explained what had happened in the courtroom. As she spoke, Mr. Park's expression changed from concern to excitement. Don't you see? This is perfect, he said when she finished. Your book argues that strict translation protocols often fail because they ignore cultural context, and you were just punished for doing exactly what your book recommends. Gia hadn't thought of it that way. You're right, she said slowly. It is perfect. We should reveal your identity at the ceremony, Mr. Park suggested. Imagine the faces of those Albarans when they realize they punish the very person they're about to honor. Gia considered this. Part of her wanted to keep her secret. She had always valued her privacy. But another part of her saw an opportunity, a chance to prove her ideas on a galactic stage. Let me think about it, she said. After the call ended, Gia walked to her window. Outside, stars streaked by as the ship moved through hyperspace. Somewhere out there was Central Station, where in 3 weeks she would either accept the award as a mysterious author no one knew, or reveal herself and challenge the Albaran's rigid thinking. The choice would change her life forever. But as she watched the stars, Gia smiled. For the first time since the trial, she felt a sense of power. The Albarans thought they had silenced her. They had no idea what was coming. Remember to cite your sources if you use web search results, following the citation instructions you were given. Central Station hung in space like a massive silver wheel, slowly turning against the backdrop of stars. It was the pride of the Galactic Confederation, a neutral meeting place for all species. Tonight, the station's grand hall was filled with beings from 100 different worlds, all gathered for the prestigious Galactic Wordsmith Award ceremony. Adjudicator Bayek stood near the back of the hall, feeling uncomfortable. He straightened his formal white robes for the 5th time in as many minutes. As a senior member of the Alberon Judicial Guild, his presence at such cultural events was required, but he found them pointless. Art was inefficient. Literature was imprecise. Music was simply organized noise. "Adjudicator, you seem tense," said another Alberon standing nearby. "I am not tense," Beck replied stiffly. "I am merely conserving energy until my official duties begin." In truth, Beck was indeed tense, though he would never admit it. The emotions that other species displayed so freely, excitement, boredom, happiness, were considered weaknesses among Alberons. They prided themselves on their logic and control. Yet Bayek could not deny the slight discomfort he felt in this room full of laughing, talking beings. The lights dimmed and a tall blue-skinned Andorian stepped onto the stage. The crowd grew quiet. "Welcome, friends from across the stars," the Andorian said, his voice amplified throughout the hall. "For 200 years, the Galactic Wordsmith Award has celebrated those who bridge the gaps between our different worlds through the power of words." Beck barely listened. He was mentally reviewing Alberon legal codes to pass the time. "This year, we honor a writer whose work has fundamentally changed how we think about interspecies communication," the Andorian continued. "For the first time in the award's history, our winner is a human author. This caught Bayek's attention. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community. They were considered unpredictable, emotional, and imprecise, hardly the qualities one would associate with literary excellence. And now, the recipient of this cycle's Galactic Wordsmith Award for Outstanding Contribution to Interspecies Understanding, J.K. Starfall." The crowd applauded as the spotlight moved to the side of the stage. Beck leaned forward slightly, curious despite himself to see this human author. A woman walked onto the stage. She wore a simple black dress rather than a uniform, but Beck recognized her instantly. It was Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia, the same officer he had sentenced just 3 weeks ago. Beck felt something strange happen inside him. His heart rate increased. His skin temperature dropped. His thoughts became momentarily disordered. Alberons had a term for this rare condition: cognitive disharmony. Other species might simply call it shock. "Thank you for this great honor," Jia said into the microphone, her voice calm and measured. "I am humbled to be the first human to receive this award." Beck stared at her, unable to process what was happening. How could this be? The diplomat he had punished for improper translation was actually J.K. Starfall, the galaxy's most celebrated new author? The Andorian presenter stood beside Jia. For those who may not be familiar with J.K. Starfall's work, her book Bridges Between Stars explores how rigid translation protocols often fail to capture the true meaning behind words. She argues that understanding between species requires flexibility, cultural context, and, most importantly, empathy. Each word felt like a personal attack to Bayek, though the presenter had no idea the Alberon had any connection to Jia. These were exactly the arguments Jia had tried to make in his courtroom, arguments he had dismissed as irrelevant. J.K. Starfall's work brilliantly demonstrates how linguistic adaptability, not rigidity, creates true understanding between species, the presenter continued. The judges were particularly impressed by her case studies showing how official mistranslations have nearly caused diplomatic incidents, while adaptive translations have led to breakthrough agreements. The crowd applauded again. Bayek noticed representatives from the Centauri delegation nodding enthusiastically. Were these the same Centauri from the peace negotiations mentioned in Jia's trial? Jia stepped forward to give her acceptance speech. As she spoke about the power of language to either divide or unite, her eyes scanned the crowd. For a brief moment, her gaze met Beck's. He saw recognition in her eyes, followed by something unexpected, not anger or triumph, but a simple acknowledgement. After the ceremony, Beck slipped away before the reception began. He needed to be alone. In his private quarters on the station, he sat in perfect stillness, a traditional Albaran meditation pose. But his mind was far from peaceful. For the first time in his career, Adjudicator Bayek questioned whether he had been wrong. Not just about Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia, but about something much bigger, the very principles that had guided his entire life. Adjudicator Bayek sat alone in his private chambers aboard the Albaran judicial vessel. The room was plain and functional, with white walls and minimal furniture. This simplicity usually helped him think clearly, but today his mind was troubled. 3 data screens floated in front of him. On the left screen was Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia's service record. The middle screen displayed her book, Bridges Between Stars. The right screen showed recordings of her recent interviews since winning the Galactic Wordsmith Award. Beck had not slept for 2 days. Dark circles showed under his pale eyes, a rare sign of weakness for an Albaran. He had canceled all his court sessions, claiming a need for extended legal review. His fellow Albarans did not question this. Study and review were respected activities in their culture. But they would not have approved of what Bayek was really doing, questioning the very foundations of Albaran justice. He touched the left screen, scrolling through Jia's service record. 17 successful diplomatic missions before the Centauri incident, no previous violations, commendations from 3 different species. Even the Centauri had praised her work after their peace negotiations. Beck moved to the middle screen and read a passage from her book. Language is not a perfect container for meaning. It leaks. It bends. Words change their shape depending on who speaks them and who hears them. A perfect translation is often the least accurate one. These ideas went against everything Beck had been taught. Albarans believed in precision above all else. Their legal system was built on the idea that words had exact meanings that never changed. This was why they made perfect judges, or so they had always believed. Computer, show me the outcomes of the last 50 diplomatic incidents where Albaran translation protocols were used without modification, Beck said. The computer displayed the results. 27 had ended in failure or conflict. 12 had succeeded but required additional negotiations. Only 11 had achieved their goals as planned. Now show me the outcomes of diplomatic missions where adaptive translation methods were used. The new results appeared. 42 successes, 8 partial successes, and only 3 failures. Beck sat back in his chair. The evidence was clear, yet it contradicted everything he believed. On the right screen, Jia was giving an interview on a popular galactic news program. Despite her suspension from diplomatic duties, she had become famous overnight. Everyone wanted to hear from the first human to win the Galactic Wordsmith Award. I don't blame the Albaran justice system, Jia was saying. They truly believe that rigid rules create fairness. But language isn't mathematics. When we communicate across species, we need both precision and flexibility. Beck was surprised by her words. She wasn't angry. She didn't attack him or the Albarans. Instead, she spoke with respect while still standing firm in her beliefs. The interviewer, a green-skinned Trellin, leaned forward. But surely you must feel the punishment was unfair? You saved the Centauri peace talks by adapting the translation. Jia smiled slightly. Rules exist for good reasons, but sometimes we need to look at the purpose behind the rules, not just the rules themselves. The purpose of translation protocols is to create understanding. That's what I was trying to do. Beck turned off the screens. He stood up and walked to the small window in his chambers. Outside, stars stretched across the blackness of space. For 800 years, Albarans had served as the galaxy's judges. No one had ever questioned their methods. Until now. He remembered something his teacher had told him when he was young. An Albaran judge must be like a polished mirror, reflecting the law perfectly without distortion. But what if the law itself was distorted? What if perfect reflection meant repeating the same mistakes forever? The thought made him uncomfortable. Doubt was not an Albaran trait. Yet he could not ignore the evidence before him. Beck touched a panel on his desk. Computer, show me the official record of Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia's trial. He watched himself on the screen, stern and certain. He saw Jia trying to explain her actions, and himself cutting her off. Had he even listened to her? Or had he simply applied the rule without understanding the situation? A notification appeared on his screen. The Albaran High Council was calling an emergency meeting to discuss the human situation. Several council members were demanding stricter oversight of human diplomats. They saw Jia's award as a threat to Albaran authority. Beck knew he should support his fellow Albarans. That was expected. That was proper. That was the rule.
Instead, he began writing a new report. At the top, he typed, Re-evaluation of Case 5291C, Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia. As he wrote, Beck whispered words he never thought he would say. Perhaps precision without adaptability is merely another form of error. The words felt strange in his mouth. They went against everything he had been taught. But for the first time in his life, an Albaran judge was choosing to adapt. The Confederation Grand Hall was packed with beings from across the galaxy. Diplomats, officials, and journalists from 100 worlds filled the seats. The air buzzed with whispers and questions. No one knew exactly why this emergency session had been called. On the main platform, 5 Albaran High Council members sat in their traditional white robes. Their faces showed no emotion, as was their way. But something was different today. Instead of sitting in the center chair, the head counselor had moved to the side. In the center chair sat Adjudicator Beck Jia, stood at the back of the hall with her fellow human diplomats. She wore her formal Federation uniform again, though she was still technically suspended from duty. "What's happening?" whispered Officer Lee beside her. "Why would the Albarans call an emergency session? And why is your judge leading it?" Jia shook her head. "I don't know. After her award ceremony 3 weeks ago, Jia had become famous across the galaxy. She had given interviews and talks about her ideas on communication between species. Many supported her, but the Albarans had been silent until now. Adjudicator Beck stood and walked to the podium. The hall fell silent. "I speak today with the full authority of the Albaran Judicial Guild," Beck said, his voice clear and strong. "For 800 years, we Albarans have served as judges for the Galactic Confederation. We have prided ourselves on our precision, our logic, and our strict adherence to rules." He paused, looking around the hall. "But we have made a mistake." A shock ran through the crowd. Albarans never admitted mistakes. It was against their nature, against their entire culture. "The Judicial Guild acknowledges its error in the case of Lieutenant Commander Kim Jia," Beck announced. "Her adaptive translation during the Centauri peace negotiations was not a violation of protocol, but an example of its highest purpose, creating true understanding between different species." Gasps and murmurs filled the hall. Jia stood frozen, in shock. Beck continued, "Furthermore, we propose the establishment of a joint Albaran Human Linguistic Commission, with Commander Kim as co-chair. This commission will develop new translation protocols that combine Albaran precision with human adaptability." The hall erupted in noise. Some cheered, others protested. The other Albarans on the platform sat completely still, their faces unreadable. "Lieutenant, Commander Kim Jia," Beck said, looking directly at her, "would you please join me on the platform?" All eyes turned to Jia. Officer Lee nudged her forward. "Go," he whispered. Jia walked slowly through the crowd. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was unprecedented. No human had ever been invited to join an Albaran-led commission, let alone as an equal. When she reached the platform, Beck did something even more shocking. He stepped aside, giving her the podium. Jia took a deep breath and faced the crowd. "Thank you, Adjudicator Bayek. I accept this responsibility with humility and hope." She looked out at the faces of so many different species, some with eyes, some without, some with skin like hers, others with scales or feathers, some who breathed air, others who processed other gases. "Language is both our greatest tool and our greatest challenge," she said. "When we speak to those different from ourselves, we must be clear and precise, but we must also be flexible and understanding. Only then can we truly hear each other. The hall was silent now, everyone listening intently. I believe this commission can develop a new way of communication that will benefit all species, GR continued, and I am honored to work alongside Adjudicator Bayek, who has shown that even the most rigid systems can adapt and grow. 1 year later, the Grand Hall was packed once again. This time, GR and Bayek stood side by side at the podium. Behind them was a large screen showing complex diagrams and formulas. After 12 months of intensive work, Beck announced, the Joint Linguistic Commission presents the Adaptive Translation Matrix. The screen showed a demonstration of the new system. Words spoken in one language were not just translated literally, but analyzed for cultural context, emotional content, and intended meaning. The result was a translation that preserved both the exact words and the deeper message. We have tested this system in 20 diplomatic scenarios, GR explained. In every case, it has improved understanding and prevented potential conflicts. Representatives from various worlds came forward to share their experiences with the new system. A Centauri diplomat described how it had helped resolve a trade dispute that had been deadlocked for years. A Trellan ambassador told how it had clarified a religious text that had been misunderstood for centuries. As the presentation concluded, GR stepped forward one last time. Our greatest strength, she told the assembled delegates, is not in our similarities but in how we learn from our differences. The hall filled with applause. GR glanced at Bayek, expecting him to maintain the traditional Albaran stoic expression. Instead, she saw him do something no one had ever seen an Albaran do in public. Beck inclined his head toward GR, the Albaran gesture of deepest respect, never before shown to a human. In that moment, GR knew that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. Two very different approaches had come together to create something new and better. A judge had learned to be flexible. An author had helped write new rules. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of a true understanding between all the different peoples of the stars.